on part 5. We left off on Friday with the next section that's going to focus on Philip Agee. And I thought Philip Agee, Agee, is a CIA, he was a CIA agent that after he figured out what being a CIA agent was all about, decided he didn't want to be a CIA agent. And I don't know if you guys have heard anything about him. What I want to do is share with you a little bit about his background because I find it quite interesting. He's written a couple of books. He is also the guy that started the Covert Action Information Bulletin, which I've used a lot of their material in investigating the CIA. And he spent a lot of time tattling on the CIA. Of course, they needed to be tattled on. But I find it interesting, just a couple of aspects. So I'm going to go over his career real briefly before we begin the part 5 of the actual book. So it says that he was born in Tacoma, Florida, which I'd never even heard of. So I had to look it up. Tacoma, Florida is a very small town just south of Gainesville, which is where the University of Florida is, for those of you who don't know. It also says that he grew up not necessarily with a silver spoon in his mouth, but he didn't grow up on the wrong side of the tracks. He went to Notre Dame. He also graduated from the Tampa's Jesuit high school, which is where my girlfriend's sons went. This is a very exclusive school, by the way. Their sports program is top notch. He went to the University of Florida's College of Law, and he joined the Air Force. He was in the Air Force from 1957 to 1960. And he was recruited basically out of the service. Now, some people have suggested he was at Notre Dame and was kind of guided through his career, but that's neither here nor there. But that kind of gives you the background for his way of thinking. Also, he was involved not just in Uruguay, but he was also involved in the 1965 overthrow of the Dominican Republic. And of course, during that coup, they accused the nationalist president of being a communist, which we see is kind of a common denominator with most of these operations. And he also said out loud that it was the CIA that executed Che Guevara, not the Uruguayan government. And also, he said a whole bunch of other things. But we're going to pay attention to his first assignment in the CIA was to Ecuador, which he helped destabilize, then Uruguay, and then Mexico. Now, what I find very interesting after he basically spilled his guts about when he wrote the book Inside the Company, a CIA diary, he was basically excommunicated from the country. The Nixon administration basically canceled his passport and wouldn't let him come home. And he ended up going initially to the UK, which basically deported him from there. He went to the Netherlands. They deported him. He went to France, West Germany, and Italy, and they all deported him. He eventually ends up in Cuba, which was the only country basically that would allow him to live. It wasn't his first choice. It basically became his only choice. His citizenship was later, and oh, by the way, the person that was doing all of that was George H.W. Bush, both as CIA director and as the president. He basically accused Agee of the murder of Richard Welch, who was the CIA operative that was assassinated. And I've talked about this quite often. He was assassinated by the CIA, not Agee. Agee had nothing to do with his assassination. He was assassinated to get Congress to stop investigating the CIA because his assassination happened right after the revelations of the family jewels in the mid 1970s. So, FYI. And also, not outside of their character, when Philip Agee died, he asked his widow to send his papers to the Robert Wagner Labor Archives. Well, it just so happens that the CIA intercepted those papers, rifled through them, took everything out that they wanted, and then shipped on the rest of whatever they didn't want to the archives. So that's who Philip Agee is. Back to the book. In February of what would be around March 1964, Philip Agee, a CIA officer from Notre Dame, had been in Washington preparing for a change of assignment. He had received 2 promotions while assigned to Ecuador, which rose him to the approximate rank of a captain in the CIA. His successes had included bugging diplomat houses, suborning and bribing local officials, and disseminating lies, i.e., propaganda, through the Ecuadorian press. He had been rewarded with a transfer to Montevideo, which is Uruguay. During his stopover in Washington, Agee spent the night in McLean, Virginia, at the house of the chief of the Brazil branch of the CIA's Western Hemispheric Division. The chief, Jim Nolan, briefed Agee on Brazil, the most serious problem the U.S. was facing in Latin America. One pressing concern for the Brazilian parliamentary investigation into the CIA's corruption in the 1962 election through IBAD, and ADEP. The CIA had spent as much as $20 million, and everyone involved at the U.S. Embassy, from Lincoln Gordon down, was worried about the incriminating evidence if it was made public. A scandal was averted only by 3 lucky developments. 5 of the 9 members of the investigating committee was themselves receiving CIA funds. 3 of the banks involved, First National City Bank, the Bank of Boston, and the Royal Bank of Canada, refused to reveal all of their foreign sources of money deposited in the IBAD and ADEP accounts. And best of all, President Goulart, still hoping to get along with Washington, saw to it that the final report was laundered. The offices of both IBAD and ADEP were closed, but to the disappointment of many, no detailed indictment of the foreign agents who had broken Brazilian election law was supplied. So again, in all of this disclosure that we have come across, the CIA has perfected election interference over and over again. To think that they do not interfere in US elections is ridiculous. They interfere in every election that they feel would hamper their ability to operate. And I did want to share, let me get this up real quick. First National Citibank. Hold on just a second. I've got this open. Um, if you look into their history, they have a very interesting history, um, because it's tied to Rockefellers. The Bank of Boston is where United Fruit, another organization, company, tied to Rockefellers and many other, John McCloy, all of those people. So you can see that the money laundering done to CIA fronts is through this network of preferred banks that all benefit from the CIA operations. Throughout the spring of 1964, a Pentagon specialist on Brazil was astounded at the impatience of liberal Democrats around Washington who kept nagging at him. When will your army people finally get going? But the Kennedy years had already proven that distinguished liberals, given authority overseas, could surmount their domestic principles. For example, as early as 1961, John Kenneth Galbraith had urged President Kennedy to undercut President Diem in South Vietnam and prepare the way for a more efficient regime headed by the army. They loved their dictators. The embattled Gouliart tried to hang on to the presidency with his only weapon, the support of the people. He scheduled a series of public addresses to reassure the population that the rumors of his tyrannical ambitions were false, because that was the purpose of IBAD and ADEP, and the $20 million were to propagandize the Brazilians and create rumor mills that it was actually Gouliart that was the dictator, kind of like what they're doing to Trump right now. They scream that he's the dictator. The propaganda all comes out that while he's not administering his government as a dictator, we just have to keep saying it over and over again, because we're going to use that propaganda to justify the actions of basically overthrowing the government and actually installing a dictator. Again, it's patterns. We see this over and over again. The president's brother-in-law tried to buttress Gouliart's position by announcing the formation of a thing called the Groups of 11. These groups would be armed, and should any military attempt at a coup, they would be prepared to resist it. The Ferdinand Gabriel, the former police reporter for one of the newspapers, had come to Rio to work for a newspaper published by Leonel Brizola. Fernando joined one of the groups of 11 and saw at once that the movement was a bluff. If a coup comes, each cell was told to resist, but how? With what? They lacked training, they lacked equipment. It was basically analogous to a peasant league that had no training. The groups of 11 were basically a joke, ineffective. He had heard later that Gordon had cited them as one more excuse for a military takeover. He marveled at the ambassador's ambition. When Gordon first arrived in Brazil, Fernando and his friends had underestimated him. Now he was at the center of a plot to overthrow the government of the fifth largest nation in the world. Gordon held a public meeting his land reform bill. Papers attacked coming out as perilous to public order. Gee, that sounds familiar. In Rio, anonymous callers were spreading the message, don't go to the communist meeting. In other words, your president is a communist. Out of Washington came news of the creation of a business group for Latin America. A business group for Latin America. You'll never believe who was on the business group for Latin America. David Rockefeller, president of Chase Manhattan Bank, presided over 37 executives of corporations like Standard Oil, United Fruit, US Steel, Ford Motor Company, DuPont, among many others. The group could not be official, nor was it seeking any publicity. Rather than involve itself with USAID projects, it would attempt to deal with the continent's political troubles personally. Late in January 1964, members had met at the White House with President Johnson. AID director David Bell and Johnson's Latin American coordinator, Thomas Mann, who was part of the Alliance for Progress that had been set up by Kennedy, all were at the meeting. The businessmen reported being received with a warm welcome, warmer than they had ever received from JFK. In the press, Gouillard's enemies were now finding it ominous that he had chosen Friday the 13th for his rally. Congress adjourned on March 7th and would reconvene on the 15th. And the possibility existed that the president planned to declare a state of siege and keep Congress closed. That was a rumor, and that was the propaganda. He never intended to do that. Okay. There was also lots of discussion about minimum wage and other labor reforms, which of course would be detrimental to the oligarchs in Washington, D.C. Gouillard was floating new proposals requiring corporations to make loans in order to expand credit for workers, pegging rentals on apartments to the level of minimum wage, launching an inquiry into all government-controlled businesses. He had also signed a decree compelling manufacturers to add a line of shoes and fabrics priced low enough for the poor to afford. Carlos Lacerda, now the governor of the state that included Rio, protested that the result would be a uniform look like the women in Russia. Choosing colors at will is the right of a democracy, he said. Everyone seemed to understand that a battle was looming. A spokesperson for Rio's industrial center proposed to train families on the use of arms since the state alone was not going to be able to defend them against the communist. There's no communist. Other reports noted that Gouillard intended to speak from a very grandstand where Vargas, one of the predecessors, had proclaimed his dictatorship. Again, drawing the analogy. The evening of March 13th arrived. Brizola spoke first and attacked the Brazilian Congress as a do-nothing Congress. Gouillard's signing of the land reform was the hallmark of the event. Besides taking sites that were next to railroads and irrigation dams, which kind of was like no man's land anyway, the bill applied to holdings of 500 hectares or more, but only if the land had not been in use. Again, this is a reoccurring theme too, because remember that the oligarchs in the US bought or appropriated through nefarious means large swaths of land in Latin America and didn't do anything with it. They held it so they couldn't have any competitors locally. He also announced plans to take over the last 7 private oil refineries, all Brazilian owned, which had not yet been brought under federal control. In his speech, Gouillard reached out to his opponents, observing that General MacArthur had carried out more radical distribution of land in Japan after World War II than anything that he planned. Watching the address on television, Lincoln Gordon was irate. First of all, these oil takeovers might not be legal. Secondly, the man standing directly behind Gouillard was Darcy Ribeiro, the former rector of Brazilian University, head of Goullart's domestic policy advisors, and according to Gordon, a very dangerous man. Ribeiro had amassed a number of black marks according to the US Embassy. He had attacked what was labeled the privileged ones, which of course is US oligarchs and their favorite in the elite. The other, let's see, he had also announced that while he himself had no intentions of joining any of the political parties, it should once again be legal. All parties should be legalized to include the Communist Party, which at the time was not legal. But we've got all these communists running around, even though you're not allowed to be. There is no such thing in Brazil at the time of the Communist Party. Now, there he was standing behind Goulart. It was perfectly obvious to Gordon that Ribeiro had even written the president's speech, although he had no proof of that. That was going to be his new assertion. Gordon was flying to Washington for consultations over the weekend. He decided that the situation had finally become untenable. Vernon Walters wired a report to the Pentagon and the SecDef, Robert McNamara, and McNamara called in his advisors to include senior analysts from DIA with good contacts in Brazil. McNamara was not debating the merits of a military coup against a civilian president. He was convinced that it had to happen. It was not important that what they called themselves. He was convinced that they were communist and had to go. McNamara was worried, however, that Goulart had already superverted the military, having packed it with so many of his supporters that the military would not be able to rise up against him. Gordon had recently coined another new phrase called overmining the government. Appointing people that was going to implement his agenda, kind of like what we're experiencing right now with the rising up of objectionable propaganda against everyone that Trump appoints. Again, they've done this for decades. They're experts at it. McNamara, they even make up terms. McNamara's only other misgiving seemed to concern the success of the coup. 6 months earlier, the U.S. had collaborated with the anti-Diem forces in South Vietnam to bring down a civilian government and substitute it with a military dictator. The first and regrettable choice had been the hulking, uneasy General Big Min, who was popular with his people, but not necessarily somebody that they wanted to get behind. It took a second small coup 3 months later to transfer power to their favorite, Nguyen Khan. In Brazil, that particular problem would not arise. Walters had remained extremely close to Huberto Castelo Branco, Branco, who would head up the proposed coup. But would it succeed? McNamara's analysts at the Department of Defense assured him that it would definitely succeed. The secretary then turned to General Joe Carroll for guidance. The U.S. did not want to be seen openly involved in the coup. McNamara said, yes, it's ideal to happen, but I'm getting gloomy reports. It was decided that the Brazilian military should succeed as planned. Tentative arrangements were made for secret help if that became necessary, i.e., clandestine arms drops by air, tankers docked nearby with U.S. oil if the quote-unquote communists succeeded in seizing Petrobras. There was even a Petrobras is actually owned by the government that they're trying to coup, but somehow it's supposed to be seized by the government that actually owns it that they're trying to overthrow. There was even a contingency plan in the unlikely event that the Russians made a move. They weren't even interested. They had said repeatedly during this process they were not going to intervene. They thought that the democratically elected president of Brazil was fine. And they had no contact with the quote unquote underground communist movement. And later, declassified State Department cables actually demonstrated that. A Chilean journalist later reported another commitment. During his stopover in Rio in early March, General Andrews O'Meara, the commander of U.S. Southcom, had promised to fly paratroopers out of Panama Zone and drop them into any pockets of resistance should they occur. So, the military had a contingency plan to get involved in the worst case scenario. In Brazil, the generals themselves were getting jittery as the time drew near. What if officers found themselves with no flight-worthy aircraft because none of the enlisted people in the Army and in the Air Force at the time was interested, because they all thought they lived in a caste system too. They weren't interested in overthrowing the government that represented the working people. So the generals were getting nervous. The generals believed that the civil war they were planning would drag on for 3 months or longer, but they believed their assurances from Gordon and their U.S. contacts that if that happened, the U.S. would get involved. The week of the coup saw a huge march against Gouliard, organized by IPES. In Sao Paulo, tens of thousands of people walked from one big cathedral called the March of the Family with God for Freedom. Now, we're going to install a dictator, but we're going to have a march for family with God for freedom. The march installed with a manifesto of Sao Paulo women on behalf of Christianity and democracy in the middle of the coup to uproot the democracy and install a dictator. Not every Christian joined in. The Archbishop of Sao Paulo forbade his bishops to join the march because he said it was being organized by McCann Erickson. Let me spell that for you. McCann. And do you know who that is? That's a U.S. advertising agency. And where do we find them throughout all of these coups? Well, obviously, they're a CIA front, just like the Lansdale came from the advertising agency in San Francisco before the CIA scooped him up and used him all over Asia. Yeah, that same thing. The advertising agencies that were used, like Gray and several other ones from both New York and Washington, D.C., fronts for the CIA. Yeah, just like that. But the rumors kept engulfing Gouliard. On March 22nd, Gouliard was forced to assure the public that he was not planning to alter the Constitution or extend his term, because that was the allegation. He was going to suspend Congress, do away with the Constitution, which required him only to have one term, because he was the dictator. On March 23rd...
Why does that sound familiar?
Yeah. On March 23rd, when Gordon returned from Washington, Gouliard's days were nearing their end, but he had one last feather. He asked Brizola to become president of the Brazilian Labor Party, perhaps hoping to bank his fire with responsibility. Brizola's faction was to form a front with the country's workers and students to retain mining concessions for Brazilians, not U.S. oligarchs. Also, he wanted to control all foreign aid. That sounds familiar. Nationalize any foreign banks that were owned in Brazil, forbid foreign owned insurance companies in Brazil, and to help the coffee exports not be controlled by US oligarchs. The conservatives responded by announcing an immense rally in Rio on April the 2nd. That was also the target date the military had chosen for their coup. By the night of March 27th, Vernon Walters was able to remove any doubt that Castillo Branco was and assure the State Department that the general was firmly committed to the overthrow. It was now clear that General Castillo Branco finally accepted leadership of forces determined to resist. On a March 13th meeting, there was a response to the God and Freedom March. The president was spending the Easter holidays, the president being Gouliard, the Easter holidays at his ranch. Gordon had also been a bit upset that Gouliard was so clearly preferred fishing and hunting with his sons than being president, which again is not true. In Gouliard's absence, 30 sailors had been arrested for making political statements, and 300 Marines were dispatched to arrest protesters. Upon his return from the ranch, Gouliard set the sailors free. They marched through the streets shouting, "Long live Django." To the senior military men, it verged on mutiny. The unrepentant Gouliard met on the night of March 30th with a party of more enlisted men and used the forum to attack the international oil cartel, the greedy owners of apartment houses, mainly US oligarchs, and dishonored tradesmen and the foreign drug manufacturers. What? Dang, that sounds so familiar. Those were the interests Gouliard said, like Vargas and Quatros before him, were financing the campaign against him, and he wasn't wrong. What happened on Monday night? Early the next day, or that happened on Monday night. Early the next day, Gordon, the ambassador, Vernon Walters, CIA, and Gordon Main, the deputy chief of mission for the CIA, gathered in the ambassador's office. The army generals were unwilling to wait another day. At 9:30 a.m. Tuesday, March 31st, 1964, the U.S. Embassy got word from an army contact the balloon is up. The generals marched their troops down Minas Gerais to join what surely would be a bloody war. Some units of enlisted men were told that they were headed to Rio to secure the city against Gouliard's enemies. In other words, they lied to them. And they said they were protecting Gouliard while they were overthrowing him because they knew the enlisted people would not play along. In Washington, an array of top representatives of the U.S. government were edgy. The March 31st telecon to Gordon came from Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, the General of the Army, Maxwell Taylor, General Andrew Amaro, CIA Director John McCone, George Ball, Thomas Mann, and Special Presidential Assistant Ralph Dungan. The message granted that such an opportunity might not reoccur, but urged the embassy to get the U.S. government not to get the U.S. government out in front of a losing cause. In other words, we need plausible deniability. The telecon also posed some belated questions, kind of actually important, like who are the possible civilians who might lay claim to the presidency, kind of a CYA session. The final question removed any possible misconceptions about which side the US government had chosen. Quote, would it be necessary for the US to mount large material program to assure success of the takeover? Unquote. Later, top secret communiques from the Joint Chiefs of Staff indicated how much the Pentagon was relying on Gordon and his staff to direct the U.S. role in the coup. One message stated that a 110-ton package of arms and ammunition was being sent to McGuire Air Force Base pending Gordon's determination whether or not the Brazilian military or police required it. In addition, a carrier task force was continuing towards the South Atlantic, awaiting Gordon's word for ports of call to demonstrate naval power, which of course we've seen in so many of these things. Have the US Navy off the coast visible just in case the government thinks that they can overwhelm or survive. They know this is a warning. And of course, Brazil at the time had their own intelligence and would know about all of these things happening. That night, March 31st, Gordon called on Kubitschek for all of the accusations of corruption and the indisputable inflation during his regime. Kubitschek remained a popular politician. Now that Gouliart was on his way out, Gordon wanted Kubitschek to lobby with the Brazilian Congress to give an appearance of legality of the new regime that the US was going to pick. An hour before midnight, the same night, General Cruel, Kruel, the most reluctant of the coup makers, finally joined with his colleagues. He had held out longer than any of the rest. He was actually afraid that, should they succeed, he would be arrested. If Gouliart knew the US government was not seamless, if he appreciated the deep division between the speeches of Kennedy and Johnson in supporting social reform and resistance, and the US business community, intelligence services, and the Pentagon and police advisors, he may have assumed that a president in Washington spoke for a stronger audience. On the night of March 31st, Gouliart learned otherwise. Romulo Betancourt of Venezuela once tried to convince Che Guevara that the U.S. had two faces, one that could look repressive and imperialistic. The other face was friendly and devoted to social justice. Che Guevara corrected him and said, no, they only have one face, and that's repression. On March 1st, as the coup became general knowledge, Gordon worried about securing the embassy. It's a little late for that. Situated only a couple of blocks from a very large square in front of an opera house, it could not be protected completely. Gordon remembered hearing that when Quadros resigned, a crowd hurling rocks had broken out several of the windows on the lower floors. So Gordon ordered all of the blinds drawn against any snipers that may be in the offing. He ordered all of the air conditioners turned off as well, because they were afraid if a fire was set on the lower floors that it would be recycled through the air conditioning vents. The ambassador had sent home most of the staff and prepared to await reports from the battlefield. With a handful of men, he called the Executive Action Group. In his stifling hot office on the 8th floor, P.S., the 9th floor, which is almost always the case, not necessarily 9, but the top floor, was reserved for CIA, and the 10th floor had the CIA communication equipment in it. Gordon ordered the documents be sent up to those 3 floors, and he posted the embassy's full complement of 20 Marines to guard them. There was no battle, however. Some students massed to protest the coup, but that was basically it. There was a couple of students shot during the night and killed when students began to amass at some of the common facilities in the downtown area. At the main Air Force base in Rio, Santa Cruz, the enlisted men, having heard early reports of the coup, seized the base and put their officers under arrest. The chief of the Air Force General Headquarters was rumored to sympathize with, with the Gouliard forces. One officer, Major Brigadier Francisco Textierra, said, "Release the officers and wait and see." Carlos Maragala, a former deputy in the parliament and a leader of Goulard friendly forces, ordered Textierra to bomb the columns coming down that was basically part of the coup. Textierra refused to take such orders and said that it would have to have come from the president himself. So they did nothing. One of the things that came out of this was there was actually documentation that was later discovered that Khrushchev, who was in charge of the Soviet Union at the time, had went on record saying they didn't want to have anything to do with Brazil. They didn't want to finance it, and they knew that any engagement in Brazil would pit them against the US, and it wasn't a battle they wanted to fight, despite them saying that the whole communists were behind all of this. Gouliard met with Brizola, who tried to persuade him to stand and fight. Their argument was long and loud, and finally, Brizola accused his brother in law of being a coward. The president said, "No, I do not want to be responsible for bloodshed among Brazilians." For Carlos Lacerda, the coup meant a great opportunity. Under the law, Vice President Mazzilli could serve 120 days. Then, given Washington's preference for a civilian frontman, the military would need someone as a front to complete Gouliard's term. Kubitschek would never take the job. Constitutionally, the interim term would bar him from seeking a full term later. But the U.S. Embassy had allowed Lacerda to understand that he would be the natural choice. Taking to the airwaves, Lacerda gave one of his most impassioned speeches. He ringed his palace with garbage trucks and urged everyone hearing his voice to rush there and join the barricades against the supporters of Gouliard, the actual president. At the U.S. Embassy, all of the Ambassador Gordon's team would know on the afternoon of April 1st came from the runners that they had sent out into the streets, that the siege was ended. It had lasted 90 minutes. Everyone in the room was aware of the historic moment that had passed. They looked to the ambassador to provide a phrase like, congratulations, all of that stuff. All the ambassador responded with was, "Turn back on the air conditioner." There was one more nervous day for Gordon, but by the nightfall of April 2nd, it was clear that the military had Brazil completely under its control. And President Johnson immediately sent a wire to the new government congratulating them from saving the country from communism. If that's not a crock of crap, I don't know what is. When Gordon returned to Washington, he found the prevailing mood jubilant. Everyone wanted to share in the credit. William Daugherty Jr., the director of AIFLD, did his boasting in a radio interview. What happened in Brazil didn't just happen. It was planned. It was planned months in advance. Many of the trade union leaders, some of whom were actually trained in our institute, were involved in the revolution to overthrow the Gouliard regime. This is a CIA front acknowledging that they were training the people that overthrew a democratically elected government. They loved it. They reveled in it. Gordon was more discreet. In their responses to Thomas Mann's testimony, which was before Congress, the congressman appeared willing to give Mann and his colleagues at the State Department a healthy measure of credit. Representative Wayne Hayes, a Democrat from Ohio, called the quick approval of the coup the best thing that had happened in Latin America policy in a long time. General O'Mara reminded congressmen of the record in Latin America since JFK had been elected president. In 9 instances, military juntas had replaced elected governments. But the general was not pointing a critical finger at that. The coming to power of Branco's government in Brazil last April, the general said, saved that country from an immediate dictatorship which could only have been followed by communist domination. You know, we're going to overthrow democracy from a fake communist threat and install a military dictator to save democracy. Congressman Harold Gross, of an Iowan Republican, inquired, "Is it a dictatorship today?" General O'Mara replied, "No, even though it was." While in Washington, and that's just the same thing that I will remind you that General MacArthur did in his testimony in front of Congress about Taiwan. He said that it was a democracy when they were bayoneting Formosans in the street in front of the U.S. Embassy on the island of Formosa by Chiang Kai-shek's KMT military. But according to MacArthur in congressional testimony, it too was a democracy. While in Washington, Ambassador Gordon ran into Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and he was reported, at least according to Gouliard, to say, according to Gordon, he said, "Well, Gouliard got what was coming to him. Too bad he didn't follow the advice we gave him when I was down there." Whether or not that's true, I don't know. That was according to Gordon. Gordon's a known liar, so you can take that for what it's worth. And that's the end of chapter 3, and we will not start a new chapter today. That we're going to end it right there. So, anyway, that's it.
So yet another overthrow of a democratically elected country. Yeah, I mean, it just seems like there is no end.
Yeah.
They truly do use the same playbook over and over and over again, don't they? I mean, it just seems like one after each, like one after another of each of their, like when someone, or like when these countries, democratically elect someone that they don't like, then they just make it sound like he's a communist and then overthrow them, right?
Yes. And it's similar to what we're experiencing right now, only their favorite word to use now is Nazi. And so they throw that around as a legitimate, according to them, a legitimate critique of President Trump. But the tactic is exactly the same all along.
Hi, Colonel. I got about 9 things to say. I remember 2 of them. So you can mention the guy Thomas Mann, and he's a really important dude to just check out his background and whatnot.
We lost you.
Guy who later becomes head of the Alliance for Progress under Lyndon Johnson.
You're coming and going all along.
Hello, can you hear me better?
I can hear you now. But Bridget, can you take him down and bring him back up?
Mexico City office.
Hold on just a second.
Amnesty or
All along, we're going to take you down and bring you back up because you keep cutting in and out. And I want to hear what you got to say.
okay. Okay.
Well, there, then.
All right, bring him back up when you get a chance.
I
threw the mic to him.
Okay. All right. Thank you, guys.
So what about current news? There really doesn't seem to be a whole lot going on over the weekend. Aside from the whole Epstein, Bongino, CIA, FBI, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, just a little bit.
I think he's back up again.
Okay. He's giving a thumb.
I just threw it to him again. All along, request the mic and it should bring you right back up.
He may be having trouble today. You did say when you opened the space, something was weird.
Yeah. There were people being dropped out of the space like used to happen all the time.
Good times.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of exposure of people that we thought were part of the movement, and you can see how they're helping to separate. In my opinion, I think that there's people, being exposed for a lot of this stuff. A lot of people that go into the different rooms are exposing themselves, in my personal opinion. So I think there's a lot of exposure going on. Where did All Along go? Come back up here, All Along.
He's there as a listener. Yeah, I don't know what happened to him.
Maybe check to see if there was an update. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else got anything? Miles, how are you doing?
Mic check.
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I'm at the FEMA camp up in central Minnesota. Coverage is not too good. Actually, at the dog park, the brand new dog park we paid for, the coverage, so they give dogs more coverage on their devices than humans. So I'm glad you can hear me for the time being. On the 4th of July, my air went out on my unit here, or my rig. But I'm dealing with it. Look, it's Minnesota, guys. Don't worry about me. On Wednesday, it's going to be raining all days. I'll be fine.
I do have less sympathy for people's AC going out in Minnesota than I do in Florida. Just saying.
And I have even less
Of
because
course.
we're 100. I have even less. I'm in Las Vegas. I'm in the oven here. So
Yeah. All right, All Along. Let's try this again.
Okay, Colonel, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yay.
Okay, sorry for that. Basically, I wanted to mention a couple points. Thomas Mann, this guy you mentioned earlier, is really a key guy to look at in depth. As you probably know, he was in the ambassador's office, or I forget CIA, but I think ambassador in Mexico City. And he's just like very, very important in terms of the JFK assassination, in terms of the question of whether or not Oswald was in Mexico City, and the intense manipulation involving both the Mexican and U.S. governments around that whole Mexico City aspect of the JFK assassination. And I know Jefferson Morley, the former Washington Post reporter who has been in charge, has been writing on the revelations in the Washington Post today. If anyone has not seen the article in the Washington Post today, it's kind of a groundbreaking article when it comes in terms of seeing the establishment media actually saying some true shit, as it were. And again, it's not so much that it's new and different for what we know already, but more like, how they're playing this establishment, how the establishment media is playing this as if they had always been on the side of truth a lot when we know that's bullshit. I mean, for example, the biggest revelation, was they issued, on the weekend of July 4th, at the very beginning of the weekend, when they knew, of course, everyone's on a 3-day weekend and it's not going to be shared as much. As you know, they literally think this way. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that we're dealing with the year 1964. It's really kind of a key year because the Johnson administration was very, very conscious of trying to appear as though there were not significant policy changes in foreign policy until Johnson could get reelected in November of 64. That was an extreme conscious effort at all levels of government after the CIA coup of 1963, right?
Yep.
And although we know, of course, that these policy differences had been extremely clear from as early as 61 when Johnson, according to Professor John Newman in his second edition called JFK in Vietnam, I mean, Johnson is already linking his B-U-R-R-S, I believe is his spelling, different military, body counts for the battles as early as than JFK was receiving. So they were literally receiving different body counts about Vietnam, JFK versus LBJ, and LBJ connected into the CIA's version of narrative. And, LBJ goes to Vietnam in 1961. He's already making his own policy with CIA. It's a truly amazing stuff in John Newman's book, JFK in Vietnam, second edition. I strongly recommend everybody read that. And so the other thing I wanted to say is, I think it's highly noteworthy that, as you pointed out, that, USAID was, established by JFK. These plans were initially, Alliance for Progress plans, which were boycotted by Capital, basically, as you, in fact, showed in that A.J. Langguth excerpt about how, they basically made their own little separate, Washington, D.C. business roundtable.
Yep.
Brazil, how charitable of them.
Yeah.
And this is above U.S. voters, sure as hell above Brazilian voters. It's just 1-800, international oligarchy cartel over here. And it's so extremely illuminating. And let's see. Lastly, I just wanted to say that in terms of A.J. Langguth's comment regarding JFK in Vietnam, okay, in my opinion, it's kind of in contrast with the historians who have written since 1998, when all of the new documents were released after the ARRB Assassination Records Review Board was passed by Congress, which was an arduous process, releasing 6 million new documents, not pages, but documents. Historians have gone 180 on the question of whether JFK was getting out of Vietnam. But my point is that A.J. Langguth's book, written in 1978, is kind of typical in the following sense. You have a kind of, you might say, left view of U.S. foreign policy in A.J. Langguth, and yet look at where he still seems to be kind of in some ways echoing the official CIA best and the brightest take on Vietnam, which we now know is deeply flawed. And yet that book was so popular. And it's very interesting that note where, your establishment Democrats and their controlled left both agree, hot damn, Vietnam. That's not an accident. Because we're not allowed to see the connection between the growth of the Vietnam War and the JFK assassination, because that is too explosive. And certainly the CIA knows how to, utilize local anesthetic propaganda, by which I mean the fake left, to neutralize that possibility and make sure those two antennae of that electric eel never meet, because that's just too volatile. We are not allowed to see that the Vietnam Memorial is a result of political assassinations, not to mention the 6 million dead in Southeast Asia. That's absolutely forbidden, especially in most of the lies are needed there. Where on the left? Lies are going to be where they're needed, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so since you brought it up, I already had the tab open. Let me talk about Thomas Mann for a second. Very interesting. And of course, Bridget will find no surprise at all that he went to Baylor University and Baylor Law in Waco.
Oh my God, always Waco. Always.
Yeah. So he tried to get in the Navy during World War II, but wasn't allowed. So he joined the diplomatic service of the Department of State in 1942 and went to Montevideo in Uruguay. And what was he doing there? He was sent there to quote unquote investigate Nazi shipping. Well, he must have really sucked at that, because he was basically put in charge of that for the entire South American area, which we know was the reception of the rat lines from Nazi Germany. So he wasn't there to prevent Nazi shipping, he was there to accommodate Nazi shipping. So, also, I have to point out that he sought military assistance from Latin America for the Korean War, basically promoting the fact that, hey, we've been here for you in Latin America. You need to be there for us as we go and do imperialism and basically ensure the division of the Korean Peninsula for, the next 80 years. Also, it says that in 1952, Mann was welcomed into the Eisenhower administration with a memo that he had wrote, and how there was no way that they could allow communists to take over Latin America because of their strategic resources. And it was absolutely in the utmost security that we prevent that from happening. So already Cuba, and again, or communists, again, this is not within 5 years of the aftermath, 7 years of the aftermath of World War II, where we know that at that particular time, the spread of communism in Latin America, chances were nil. They did not have the manpower nor the industrial base to do this. In Guatemala, it says that he attended the inauguration of Arbenz Guzman, who they absolutely hated. While he was there at his inauguration, the democratically elected president of Guatemala, he pronounced that he was a communist. He had no supporting documentation, no evidence whatsoever, but Arbenz had already made it well known that he was in support of taking on United Fruit. Mann opposed Arbenz land reform, which was basically United Fruit, fearing that Guatemala would become a test case for the other nations in Latin America who were basically imperialist colonies of U.S. oligarchs. So, of course, Guatemala was the coup that happened right after the Iranian coup in 1953 that basically overthrew Arbenz Guzman and installed a fascist dictator. Mann was recalled from Greece to go to Guatemala, and he established Norman Armour as the U.S. ambassador and sought to support the new military dictatorship of Castillo Armas. So Man is deciding who's going to be in charge of ambassadors in their newly created military dictatorships. He was basically, as a result of him being involved in the overthrow of the Guatemalan government, given basically veto power over any Guatemalan policy. After a new oil law was proposed in Guatemala, he basically said no, and Armas said that unless Man agreed, he couldn't do it. So they're literally controlling the foreign countries out of the State Department. So it goes on to say in September of 1957, Man moved to Washington, D.C. to become the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, which means economic warfare, just for those of you watching. Trans-American economic problems were throughout Latin America. And at the time, you had Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who has direct ties to United Fruit, Sullivan and Cromwell, and all of the oligarchs who had business in Latin America. At the time, Vice President Nixon traveled, and I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but it's actually funny. I looked up a couple of articles. When Vice President Nixon traveled throughout Latin America on like a tour, he was greeted by mobs of people because they all knew that the United States was overthrowing their governments, and they hated us for that. Man also was responsible for the Inter-American Development Bank, which we've come across multiple times in Operation Gladio as basically a funding source, because many make that an analogous to the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II that we know had money siphoned off of it for Operation Gladio. And there are lots of ties of the Inter-American Development Bank to Operation Condor in Latin America. So he's behind that as well. During the Kennedy administration, Man, weirdly enough, leaves right before the Bay of Pigs and ends up as the ambassador to Mexico, as all along pointed out, and just so happens to be there when all of the shenanigans of the JFK assassination happened, as was just pointed out. LBJ reappoints Man back to the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, and he also made him in charge of USAID. So imagine this. We all know the USAID is a CIA front. Imagine being the economic arm of the CIA while at the same time sitting as the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs while Operation Condor is running wild all over Latin America. So the same guy that's creating Operation Condor in the State Department is in charge of all the money funding Operation Condor in Latin America. So just let that hang out. He's very famous for the Mann Doctrine. And Mann, in 1964, gave a secret speech to U.S. officials that laid out the administration's policy for Latin America. He didn't even mention the newly created Alliance for Progress because JFK created that, and Lyndon B. Johnson didn't basically want to have anything to do with that. That wasn't his policy. Mann's policy called for, quote, non-intervention against dictators if they were friendly to U.S. business interest. But he wanted intervention against they labeled communist because it was anti-American business. So you see how that works? As long as we label you a communist, you're anti-American business. And we're very much in front of, we're very much in support of any dictator as long as they accommodate our oligarchs. Mann supported the military overthrow of the democratically elected government in Brazil, as we pointed out. He assisted this takeover directly by diverting USAID money to Brazil away from Gouliart's actual government and into the hands of the coup plotters. In Chile, Mann ordered an intensive and coordinated campaign in favor of Eduardo Frei against Salvador Allende in the 1964 elections. So he was involved in that one as well. Now, that was the first time that Allende ran for president, and he was not elected, largely due, at least in part, to the CIA's intervention to successfully make sure he did not. It said that Mann had authored a 10-point plan to ensure Allende did not get elected. Threats of economic retaliation against Allende if they against Chile if they elected Allende. CIA and U.S. Information Agency, another CIA front, production and dissemination of propaganda against Allende, $70 million in emergency loans to prop up the economy and reduce unemployment before the election to make Salvador Allende less appealing. Secret contact with U.S. government and businesses, with Chilean businesses, military, police, clergy, trade unions, and the Masonic Lodge for the purpose of opposing Allende. The efforts were successful in 1964, but not successful in 1970. He was involved in Panama during a period of Panamanian wanting the Panama Canal Treaty actually negotiated, because remember, Panama never signed the original treaty. So Johnson finally agreed to begin renegotiating that. He was involved in Bolivia during their destabilization efforts. Mann also commented on the fact that in the Dominican Republic, which, by the way, we couped them as well, Mann labeled democratically elected Juan Bosch a communist. Oh my gosh, I'm shocked. And supported the U.S. invasion in 1965. Mann personally insisted on the production of a cable which would describe danger to American citizens in the Dominican Republic. At the same time, he pressured the military government to crack down on Santo Domingo in quote unquote insurgents, actually people that didn't want to live under a U.S. imposed military dictator, those people. So, yeah, he's a very bad dude. I agree with you all along 100%. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think he is a very bad dude, and he kind of, here in some ways, reminds me of like what we see in this period of like 60 to 70, 60 through 1980, if you will, is that kind of you have an ostensible kind of government with the three branches kind of doing their thing, and yet you have the CIA through the State Department sort of working kind of like, I'm not sure if it's the right metaphor, but kind of lysosomes, or that part of the cell that is designed to break down the old order so that a new order may rise up. And we kind of see that happening in the international trade march, right? Which are, the CIA is sponsoring in New Orleans, Dallas, New York City with the World Trade Center, et cetera. It's kind of like they're introducing this corporate emphasis, corporate internationalism, damned if you do, damned if you don't, even while the older policy is still in place, and just allowing it to spread, like a cancer through the rest of the government as time passes. And then at the same time, we see that with, in Mexico City, the CIA is definitely working with a very unique situation that they have there with with Thomas Mann to undermine, the ostensible policy of earlier under JFK, a big switch where the policy is going through the governors and direct investment from Latin America and not through the national government of Brazil. And that policy was boycotted by the U.S. Businessmen, as you pointed out. And it kind of reminds me of another sort of domestic structure in which, you look at how the CIA handled the assassination of MLK, and you look at Lyndon Johnson's somewhat unique relationship with the governor of Tennessee. And it's like, formerly we have a policy called federalism where the states are doing their own thing, as it were, as we teach the school children. It's 100% of the population. If it's not the truth, that could matter. And yet we see LBJ working with his floor manager in 1960, was the governor of Tennessee, and boy, did LBJ and CIA do work very well with that particular state government to manipulate the MLK trial and manipulate and conclude the framing of James Earl Ray for not assassinating Dr. Martin Luther King. So we see, kind of the uses of these special relationships in a given embassy in international politics or in a given state to sort of undermine the ostensible formal structure of in domestically federalism. And in short, I urge everyone to read this new book by called The Deep State Assassination of MLK. And I think I wrote you about it earlier, but it's basically written by a sixth-generation Tennessean. And if you want to see the CIA go right from federal government to state government, in a way that you've never seen before, this sixth-generation Tennessean is the one to show us how that's done. I mean, he's got two judges dying with James Earl Ray's case on their table and next on their docket. And when you see these judicial state deaths, you're understanding it could well be a federal affair.
Yeah, right. Benjamin, how are you today?
I'm doing good. How you ladies doing?
I'm doing great. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Yeah, I took, about a 3-4 week hiatus, got away. A lot going on with the family and the kids. Summertime, wanted to...
Absolutely. While
I'm here, I'll just say, I for all those that, just coming across Colonel for the first time, maybe, she is the real deal. Her and the rest of the ladies on her team, they've been doing a lot of good stuff and letting a lot of people know what's been going on for a very long time. And a lot of these actors, they haven't been held accountable over the years. Hold on, baby, hold on. And a lot of these bad actors haven't been held accountable over the years. So that's to let you know that they're still, those types of people are still calling the shots, and what's going on. Just real quick, I absolutely believe a military operation is going on. And here's the reason why. Trump let us all know that, treason was committed. The Supreme Court upheld a decision recently that, gives him the authorization to be able to use the military if there's a threat against America. So a lot of these things that are playing out, is smoke and mirrors. Like Trump was telling us, he said, you don't tell the enemy your plans. So that lets you know that a lot of things that you see aren't really real. Like, for instance, I absolutely believe that Elon is still helping Trump. And I'll end it. That's great to hear you guys.
Thank you. Okay. And with that, I hear it raining outside. Normally, my Starlink doesn't work as well while it's raining. So probably need to wrap this up. And we will be back tomorrow at 4:00 to continue with our book into chapter 4. Go ahead, Stellar.
Major just asked to come up, and I know that they always have really good stuff. And I agree with Benjamin and with Bridget and stuff like that. Dark MAGA, he's exposing, you know, the silliness within and stuff like that. I agree with you, Benjamin, too. I think that there's so many different operations going on, and and cousin, all you guys are amazing. And got these different